Then the moment she says, violin kudu, fiddle kudu, and that moment she becomes a tough taskmistress with a stick in her hand. If there is interest, everything else falls into place, because interest itself is an indicator of sensibility.
Right.
How can ugliness be satisfying? It's satisfying because it has transcended its qualitative aspect. What is the function of music?
Right.
Function of music or any art is to
Namaskar. We are with Shri Deepak Raja ji, world-renowned musicologist, a very well-renowned sitar player. The subject of our discussion today is does Indian classical music have impact on babies and children? There has been research conducted in US and Europe, basically titled the Mozart Effect, which had used empirical and statistical analysis to show that evidence exists that Western classical music does have an impact on babies. So that's the subject of research, and if you could share your thoughts, initial thoughts, and then we can take this further the way.
Okay, I look at it this way. The proposition that we are broadly making is that a musically cultivated mind achieves a higher than average level of efficiency in managing non-musical tasks,
Right.
cerebral tasks, let's put it this way. I look at it slightly differently, because why only music? We perceive our world through 5 different senses. The cultivation of any of the senses should affect the overall efficiency of the brain in processing sensory signals.
Right.
Right. So I would say that if a child is introduced to paintings at an early age, may also develop the same kind of ability to handle non-artistic tasks.
Right.
Or a child learns to cook early,
Right.
the sense of smell, sense of taste. I don't see any strong logic for believing that music alone does it.
Right.
The next question is, does research done on Western classical music apply to Indian music?
Right.
I'm not so sure.
Right.
Then there's another interesting idea here in this, that universally, what the exact word is, universally appreciated from birth. I question all of these. Universally appreciated from birth. What is universally appreciated? Let's start with this. There is no music that is universally appreciated.
Right.
Second, appreciation. What appreciation are we talking? What level of appreciation are we
Do
talking
we even know
about?
that it's being appreciated?
What constitutes appreciation?
Right.
And from birth, can there be anything that, now there is of course this question, nature versus nurture. Can there be anything that what does appreciation mean? It means converting neuroacoustic signal into meaning, right? How much of it is genetically transmitted?
Right.
And how much is acquired through the environment? I don't know. See, some of the research done in India suggests that on a very small scale, I wouldn't say it's a very large study. I think Mukund Lath was one of the participants of that study, and B.C. Deva.
Okay.
they looked at the heredity aspect of musicianship.
Okay.
And some foreign scholars have also done that. And they said there's about 60% chance that a musician's son or daughter
Right.
will have musical potential. It doesn't say necessarily achieve the same level of musicianship.
Okay.
So 60% is neither here nor there.
Right.
So if we are talking about cultivating the musical sensibility, I take the point that we're talking about the musical sensibility.
Right.
What does it constitute? It constitutes an ability to pitch differentiation
Right.
and pattern recognition.
Right.
And pattern recognition includes rhythm,
Right.
because rhythm is a principle of grouping sound signals.
Right.
If you've seen the work of Carl Seashore's Psychology of Music,
Right.
1930s, I think. So it's a principle of grouping. Now, pitch recognition, or let's say pitch differentiation, whether a sound is higher or lower than another, I haven't seen research on this, but it would seem that it is largely genetically determined.
Okay.
To what extent it can be improved with training, I don't know.
Right.
I haven't seen studies on that.
Right.
And today, with the training devices that can be developed for it, there may be a larger possibility to develop that ability.
Right.
Pattern recognition is probably much more cultural.
Right.
And that too, from birth, the study I have seen of very young kids, I'll give you a copy, I wrote a small piece on that.
Mm-hmm.
It shows that very young kids, infants of 2 and 3 years, they showed signs of differentiation between sad music and happy music.
Okay.
Now again, this was done, a study was done in England.
Okay.
How universal is this?
Right.
And they came to the conclusion that major scale is happy music, and minor scale is sad music.
And sad and happy in their terms is also a totally different concept as compared to.
No, and interpreting the signals that you're getting from a 3-year child,
Right.
a 2-year-old, 3-year-old child,
Right.
is a tough one. I mean, okay, the happy and sad is, I think, binary enough. But can I use that information to develop a methodology for orienting children towards music?
Right.
And again, the question here is, does even that response not depend on pitch differentiation capabilities, which are probably, in my opinion, probably largely genetic?
Genetic.
Because let's assume that at the age of 2 or 3, they have not been cultivated.
Right.
So there must be a range of abilities available in the universe of children born. To say that anything can be universally appreciated, or there's any music that is universally even interpreted as sad or happy. And Sangeet Ratnakar very clearly says
Right.
that the rag itself has different emotional content
Right.
based on the lay.
Right.
So Vilambit lay communicates one lay, Madhya lay communicates another lay, and Drut lay communicates a different sentiment.
Yeah.
So even the emotional content of the same melodic framework
Is.
can be different.
Right.
So that minor scale, major scale looks like, okay, an interesting study. Somebody will get a PhD for it. But I don't know to what extent that research can be used.
Right.
So that is my broad perspective on the research that you have quoted.
Right. If we were to speak around the qualities of Indian classical music, we'd spoken about happy and sad, which was basically a Western concept of major and minor. Here we have navarasas, we have so many different talas, complex talas and complex ragas, and we have had cases of most musicians who are there today, they've had at least some sort of a listening exposure at their homes, where musicians used to come and go and they were exposed. Even a baby till the age of 3, it cannot speak, but the networks in the brain are being developed, and through such level of complex ragas, which are not as simple as something like a Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, and so on. So from there, what I want to really get to is, would that have a greater impact on a baby or a child as compared to a simplistic bilaval based rhymes which we are seeing?
I'm asking a more fundamental question on this.
Right.
I mean, the basic theory of education you start from is that you start from the simple and move gradually towards the more complex.
Right.
You start from the easy to understand to the more difficult to understand. You start with the cyclical, which is the easiest to understand, to things that are more linear.
Right.
Which require a progressive accumulation of the experience.
Right.
Classical music requires a progressive accumulation of the. It's almost like architecture.
Absolutely.
To appreciate architecture, you have to enter a building.
It needs a deeper level of
I
understanding.
mean, you can see the Taj Mahal from a distance. It's a pretty picture.
Right.
It's only two-dimensional. Until you enter that, you haven't really understood Taj Mahal. I realized that if you have to teach them the basics of 10 rags, they said stick to 10 rags. Start first only with the sargam.
Right.
Then get into the alankars. And the only composition you should teach them is a sargam composition. Because you are then teaching them, one is the basics of the intervals,
Right.
the acoustic intervals between the swaras.
Right.
And you are teaching them the arrangement, the sequencing of swaras as required.
Right.
And teach them in the simplest possible tals, either take adi talam or teen tal, but don't go beyond the tals which have equal subdivisions.
Right.
Don't go into your rupaks and jhap tals.
Right.
Because again, that becomes complex because subdivisions are different.
Right.
The chand is different. So keep the chand simple. And beyond that first module, you need not, I mean, if you can get to that level of teaching only a sargam geet, you've done a good job of introducing 10 basic rags. So develop only that, but at that level, they will begin to even relate the film music that they hear to the rags.
Right.
If you tell them this is Shankara Bharanam, they will say, what the hell? Even the word doesn't make much sense to them at that stage. You are
Right.
talking about 7 to 10-year-olds.
Right.
So I would say that yes, basic cultivation of the musical sensibility has to start with just pitch recognition
And pattern.
and pattern recognition. So once we ingrain in children an understanding of some patterns and common patterns,
Right.
they can start relating it to the sounds and they can start organizing their musical ideas
Right.
in what they need not necessarily see as a rag, but it gives them a method of organizing their musical ideas.
Right.
So I think that is, if we are talking about cultivating the musical sensibility, and then I see nothing wrong in them not being interested in classical music, because classical music, see, let's put it this way. Music, what is the function of music?
Right.
Function of music or any art is any of these arts is a specialist language for communicating emotions, which language is inadequate to do.
Right.
So, if they find that film music communicates better, relates better to them, they may drift towards that.
Right.
Martial music appeals to them, they can relate to that. For folk music, because basically the idea of any art is to enrich you emotionally.
Absolutely.
And a heightened awareness of your emotionality can come through any kind of emotional experience.
Right.
Any emotional experience raised to a level of intensity rises above that and becomes just delight. That is why even a very sad song actually leaves you happy.
Right.
You can cry and you feel good about it.
Right.
That's why in Kathakali you see something that you would call bibhats.
Right.
I mean, that their dress, their costume alone is bibhats. And yet it's satisfying. How can ugliness be satisfying? It's satisfying because it has transcended its qualitative aspect. And that is what Taittiriya Upanishad says, Raso Vaisaha. That Lord Vishnu, you are Rasa. There is a practical aspect where to understanding the aesthetics, where a musician purposively he sees a certain rag as sad, or he sees the rag as viraras and he presents it as viraras.
Right.
Somebody else may see it as very differently, because rag, you can't have a dictionary of rag.
Right.
Nobody has attempted it, thank God. And yet, as I've said in my book, Raganess of Rags, that there is a universal component of experience in the melodic framework that can have universal appeal.
Right.
And there is a cultural component which only people within that culture can perceive.
Right.
Take Rag Durga, Sarimapa Dasa. An American musician will play Durga quite fine, but he cannot put into it the understanding that an Indian musician will do, because who can see Durga as Durga.
Right.
Those people will play Durga with so much delicacy and nuance that Durga ceases to be the ferocious Durga she is.
Right.
A Hindustani musician will do Sare Mapa Dhasa, all Khada Sur,
Right.
because the ferocious Durga can't have Lalitya.
The Veera.
She is not seductive.
Right. Absolutely.
And some of our Indian musicians have also now started presenting Durga as a seductive rag. And it says, the Durga hai, Saraswati hai. So, there is a universal component of aesthetic appeal which a certain, see, finally there is a tonal geometry of a rag. They have an acoustic relationship.
Right.
When you sequence them in a certain way, it acquires a certain elegance.
Right.
So, that anyone anywhere in the world can be sensitized to, although it may be an unfamiliar juxtaposition. The Sangatis may be unfamiliar to an American or a Frenchman or a German. But if he hears it 2-3 times, he can see some elegance in it. But he cannot relate to the cultural meaning. He can see only the melodic meaning. Melodic meaning may have value.
Right.
So there are so many of these issues. So to talking about educating young children, take them to the level where they can start relating the patterns to the sounds they see around themselves.
Right.
And if they get involved in the more complex aspects of music, and classical music happens to be the most complex.
Right.
So, and only with repetitive exposure that they can start. There are different kinds of response. Any sensory trigger, any sensory experience has mainly three kinds of response. One is the animated response, there is a cerebral response, and there is an emotional response.
Right.
Now, classical music requires a cerebral response in addition to an emotional response. In fact, the cerebral enables you to acquire the emotional response because you have a set of rules. You must understand the rules, and the appreciation lies in how those rules are applied.
Right.
And sometimes beauty may lie in defying all the rules. So, at training young children, come to the level of pattern recognition, pitch differentiation. Refine it as much as you can without defining what kind of music they should move towards. Because it's a matter of a great cultural aspect here.
Right.
One is your hereditary issue.
Right.
To give you my own example, on my father's side, directly there was no music, although my father's uncles were great patrons of music. They were fond of music. Nobody had studied music.
Right.
My mother came from a musical family. All musicians, they all had studied classical music.
Okay.
When my mother got married, she was just about 18 and struggling to put her life together. When I was about 5, she told my father she wanted to learn the sitar.
Okay.
So, okay. A sitar was bought and a teacher was hired. I was 5 years old, 4 or 5 years old. The teacher would come in the afternoon when I had just come back from school, I had lunch and would be sleeping. That is the only time my mother was free. So, after the teacher left, I would get up, go and pick up the sitar and start playing on my own.
Okay. And basically you had heard in your sleep.
Sleep or half sleep or whatever that afternoon sleep was.
Right.
And I started playing on my own. So first what happens is, when it comes to classical music, first is interest.
Right.
And if there is already a genetically infused musical sensibility, it first expresses itself in interest.
Right.
And when that is identified, then its cultivation starts.
Right.
The issue here is all the time, I think, when we talk about cultivating, that first is identifying is there interest.
Right.
If there is interest, everything else falls into place, because interest itself is an indicator of sensibility.
Right. So the question here, sir, is: does interest is interest also a function of what we are actually exposing the baby to? If the baby is not exposed to certain things at all, wouldn't the direction in which the interests develop be a function of what it has been exposed to? And from there comes the question of exposure to classical music.
If there is no sensibility, you can expose the child to any amount of music, any kind of music, and there will be no response.
Okay. So you're saying it's
that
more
pitch
genetic.
the pitch differentiation
Right.
is the key. One is higher and lower. I mean, when we are talking about any activity or any expression, is higher or lower, and how much spatial distance and how much acoustic distance.
Right.
So if that sensibility is not there, no amount of exposure is going to bring the child in.
Right. And we are saying that's more of a nature and more of a genetic
the interest will, the nature, the genetic will give you an indication of through the interest.
Right. Okay.
So, if we are talking about only 1% of the population who, let's say, attend concerts or buy recordings or listen to recordings or listen to it on the radio,
Right.
then we are talking about a very small number of people who can graduate to the level of classical music.
Right.
But there's nothing terrible about not enjoying classical music,
Right.
or not being able to appreciate classical music.
As an aspect of development, so there are two aspects that we are actually talking about. The research in US, which basically speaks around babies becoming more intelligent listening to classical music, is definitely one aspect. But moving away from that, the second aspect of multiple experiences of popular musicians, such as if you take Pandit Bhimsen Joshi ji for example, there is an aspect of his life where he listens to a recording at the age of 8 or 9, and then he runs away, and then suddenly his interest in music peaks, and then he's in search of a guru. So so how would you look at, and if he probably hadn't listened to that recording, what would have happened, and how would you really see this?
See, the interest must have been there.
Right.
And in any case, he was a product of a very rich musical culture.
Right.
It was triggered off by listening to the recording. My God, this is what music can be. I want to sing like him. And that was history. So, the interest has to be triggered by something.
Right.
As it was in my case, my father deciding, okay, we'll buy you a sitar, hire you a teacher. Had that not happened, I may not have got into music.
So
I don't know.
So at the age of 5, you started experimenting, or maybe starting to play with the sitar. Would you see that? Would you see the same happen probably at the age of 10, when you would have been exposed to many other things? How would you see yourself at?
See, in those days, we used to listen to film music was there.
Right.
Although we weren't, my parents were not cinema goers in that sense.
Right.
And there was no TV then. So they were not regular cinema goers. Movie was maybe 2 or 3 times in a year or something. If there was something interesting, we'd be taken. But it was there on the radio. Radio Ceylon was there. There was no Vivid Bharati in those days. So film music was there, and devotional music was there. 78 RPM records were being played in the house.
Right.
And they were not only classical music. We had film music records also coming in the house. So we were listening to all kinds of music. But I got interested in classical music. So it was maybe a slightly better developed neural network there.
Right.
But as a young kid, I used to sing also, and I used to sing a lot of film songs. I and my sister used to, when the first tape recorders came, we used to record duets together and all that.
Right.
So my sister also got interested, and she's become a good singer.
Right.
But she hasn't remained. She studied classical music, but she didn't become a good classical singer. She became a very good light music singer.
Right. So there was definitely a musical environment, regardless of whether it was just classical music. It was different kinds of music, but there was definitely a musical environment.
There was a musical environment, but you see, I won't say it was very musical in that sense.
Right.
But there was a teacher coming to our house 3 times a week, music teacher coming to the house, mother was learning.
Right.
So something had developed. And again, maternal home, maternal family. Every summer vacation we would be at my mama's place. Everybody is a musician.
Right.
At night after dinner, everybody would. my uncle and aunt both played the violin. So they would sit with the violin and we would be singing bhajans late into the night before they go to sleep. So different. When I came to Bombay, there were my cousins who were learning sitar. So I used to sit with their teacher and learn something.
Right.
So that, in that sense, in the household itself, it wasn't a very strong musical environment. But records were playing all the time. I mean, records were being bought and they were expensive in those days.
Right. Any experiences that you have heard from the masters, maybe from Pandit, your Guruji, Pandit Arvind Parekh ji, around whatever they would have mentioned around children and kids learning classical music, any experiences or stories that you can remember and share?
My first sitar teacher was my mother teacher. We lived in a sprawling house in Delhi. My father was secretary to the government.
Right.
The huge garden. And the day I was supposed to learn, I tell you, Master ji, आज मूड नहीं है, आज नहीं सीखना है. अरे बाबा, थोड़ा बैठ जाओ, नहीं सीखना है, आज मूड नहीं है. आज क्रिकेट खेलने का मूड है. So my master ji would come out with me, he'd put up the stumps and we'll play cricket for half an hour, 45 minutes.
Right.
So that he'll persuade me to come and learn.
Right. I think it takes a lot of patience in the guru also to teach.
Now, then, after the teachers, in the evening, after come back from school, mother will sit with a stick.
Right.
30 minutes. Practice what you've learned. Then it went up to 1 hour. Again, sit with a stick.
Right.
So, I have seen both. Master ji trying to seduce me into learning by playing cricket with me for 1 hour.
Right.
And the mother is saying, "Ek ghanta to riyaz karna hai," and she'll sit with her stick and she won't get up until I've finished 1 hour.
Right.
And a similar pattern of carrot and stick I have seen when I have seen Dr. Rajam training her granddaughters.
Right.
When I have photographs of one day we spent a whole day with Dr. Rai and my wife spent a whole day with Dr. Rajam. I mean, she is a caring, doting grandmother up to the time she is not a student. Then the moment she says, violin kudu, fiddle kudu, and that moment she becomes a tough taskmistress with a stick in her hand.
Right. So it's two different personalities.
Totally two. I have seen both the avatars in the same meeting, in the same visit to her house.
I've always been wondering how would it been like 3 generations of music passing down and 2 different roles, and especially a child is very close to its mother. So the acceptance as a guru, seeing 2 different personalities.
And as young kids, I remember the 2 girls were petrified of the grandmother. Absolutely, she was. And she is a fairly stern woman, a very nice, very civilized person. But she is a stern person.
Right.
And even her music is so disciplined and immaculate discipline. Her badat, her method of handling a rag, immaculate. Somebody I have great respect for, her music. And that, I think, comes from the Carnatic background.
Right.
That discipline comes from the Carnatic background.
Right. In fact, she hails from a family of violinists, and her
Yeah,
brother.
Narayana Iyer, big.
And her brother has such a different style of playing, which is more discreet, Carnatic oriented, and Dr. Rajam's playing is so continuous and Gamaka oriented and Gayaki style. I could never imagine that in one family you would have such diverse ways of playing.
Have you heard Dr. Rajam playing Carnatic music? Sangeeta had promised me a couple of recordings. Apparently, she did duet with Professor T. N. Krishnan about a few years ago.
Yes.
Uh,
I think they
about
played
7 or 8 years.
Hamsadwani, I've heard.
Yeah, in Chennai they had a concert. They played Carnatic music together. And Amma was telling me that after many, many years I've played Carnatic music. I don't know whether I had made sense or not. I said, Amma, how can you forget what you've grown up with?
Right.
But yes, I mean, some things will change, but it will not sound phony because she's still a very fine musician.
Right. So you think the discipline in her, the disciplinarian in her really had an impact on her children
No,
and her grandchildren?
and the Carnatic tradition itself, the training systems in Carnatic music are far more rigid
Right.
than in Hindustani music.
Right.
That is why Carnatic music can produce every year 300 presentable musicians on the stage, while Hindustani music may not produce 30.
Right.
But it's a different music and requires many more years to reach a presentable level.
Absolutely.
It's a different kind of music. I mean, you can't say that Carnatic music is any less demanding than Hindustani music.
Thank you so much, sir, for
Pleasure talking to you.
sharing such interesting experiences and anecdotes and insights from what you have seen. And I think we are going to benefit greatly from these.
I'd be very interested to see, the sum total of what you put together.
Right.
Because it will be in education.
Right. I mean, it's a learning for me along the way. I come with my own biases.
Naturally.
But then
Naturally.
along the way, they are all getting corrected.
Yeah. And research is about adding to knowledge.
Right.
And the first ingredient of research is curiosity.